I suppose one question that occurred to me is an experience that a number of countries had. I know the UK had, was that the law as it stood made it very hard to separate out depositors from other creditors to a bank that was failing. So one absolutely can understand that depositors politically, and for lots of good reasons, one would not want to see them go home empty-handed, but one might feel differently with sort of big international sort of investors who had bought the bonds of different banks and then are supposed to exercise some sort of oversight, some sort of market discipline by requiring a higher yield, in particular if the bank is behaving in an overly risky way. And it was difficult to separate out those bondholders from retail depositors. It sounds like you were able to do that in Ghana. Is that correct? And how did you manage?
Well, yes, we were able to do that because the balance sheets of the banks in Ghana are very simple. They're not complex balance sheets. They're not market funded as much as you would have in advanced markets. Our capital markets are still very shallow, not deep at all. So basically, most of the liabilities on the bank's balance sheets here were deposits. Very clear and very clear deposits. In some of these banks we closed, 9 banks we closed, there were a few of them that had lines of credit from foreign banks. Okay, and those were easily recognizable. Those were not deposits. There were lines of credit from very well-established foreign banks that was meant for trade finance or some other type of on-lending to SMEs and all of that. And we held the view, as you just said, that they had the capacity to have supervised these institutions, for want of a better word. They had the capacity to have sort of monitored these institutions very well because they had covenants in place and their lending agreements to them and all of that. So they could have done a whole lot more due diligence, which your retail depositor would not have been able to do. But then again, we didn't have any standing funds to pay anyone, and the assets of these banks were quite gone in terms of value. And therefore, this was government policy to pay depositors. And it was very clear. It was meant for depositors alone, not meant for other types of creditors. We didn't have bondholders. These banks didn't have any bonds on the market. In fact, the banking law under which we resolved these institutions gives us power to do a bail-in, i.e. to restructure debt on the books of these failed institutions. And so that people ask, well, why did you not bail in? Why did the government bail out depositors instead of bailing? Again, the question is the simple nature of the balance sheets. You bailing bondholders and more sophisticated creditors, but you don't bailing depositors, right? As much as at least the retail ones. And therefore, government's policy was based on the fact that these depositors were vulnerable, and in any event, it would have had a huge ripple effect in the entire system, and therefore it was important to help these depositors. But the rest of the creditors, very easily, separated from depositors, are waiting in line, and to the extent of any value realized from assets that are left in the receivership, they get to be paid with time.
I see. And so then a second question is, as you say, a central bank and Ghana included doesn't just willy-nilly just go and resolve banks. It's done carefully and with due thought and attention and care. But that therefore potentially also takes time. And that might mean that depositors might understand that their deposits are with an institution that looks like it's in trouble just from the local media and the like. Did you successfully avoid runs, and how before you succeeded in resolving and moving the deposits to a safer, larger bank, and how was that accomplished?
That was very difficult. I remember those days when I would wake up in the morning. There's a local radio station that had a 6:15 a.m. business news session. And my worst nightmare was to wake up to business news on one of these failing institutions, and occasionally they would publish something on the 6:15 news segment, and the whole day was a disaster, because we'll be scrambling around trying to figure out how to manage that. So that's it's always difficult through the process of consultation and dialogue with shareholders and directors and board members. What do you do to safeguard the interests of depositors? And how do you know that the market won't go ahead of you? Because they may just force an institution into insolvency if you're not careful, before you take action. And so that's always a very tricky balance for resolution authority. In the case of the institutions that we did, that at some point it was inevitable that there would be some bad press, because depositors would go to these institutions for their money, and be told to come back and come back and come back. And so that really was one of the overall considerations that we took into account in doing this. But then what we did, we had to use a lot of very strong communication also around our actions, because we did it in segments. There was a point in time where the market wasn't sure whether there was more coming. Well, you closed 2 in 2017, and you closed 2 in March. No, in August, you closed 5 in August 2018. Oh, by the way, should we expect more? And therefore, what do we do with the money? And then when we were done with the banks, the smaller financial institutions were also limping, and it was evident because of depositors not getting access to the funds. And so what we found was a flight to quality. We were done with the banking sector cleanup, and the market wasn't very sure about what was happening with the smaller ones, because it was evident that there were a few of them that were struggling. So we found their depositors move their funds to the banking sector, right? So there was a bit of that there as well. But we actually had to engage the public very strongly, very frequently, through all sorts of media, just to let them know that we knew what we were doing and things were under control, and that everything was going to be okay. But it's one of the worst nightmares of a regulator, when you're trying to balance those competing interests.